Good afternoon, everybody. Now that we're right on noon, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Warren Docker. I'm the new president and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society, and this is a great time for me, and we're all very excited because this is the very first time we've been able to come back in person and do an in-person brown bag lecture. So this is a real big occasion. So we want to offer a lot of thanks to you all for coming down and listening, and for being a part of the community, and for everything that you do for us. I'm for one very excited, and now that we're hopefully emerging from the COVID experience, I'm hoping that I can get out and start meeting more people. I joined at the end of January and have been setting things up here, so we're very excited. And while you're out here, I would like to encourage everyone, if you have time, to go into our feature gallery exhibit, which is on one of the premier portrait artists of East Tennessee. It's an exhibition of Shaver's work, and there's some very interesting portraits that Shaver painted, and it sort of goes through that through time, and it's a tremendously interesting exhibition because it lets you see, if you think about today, how everybody's going around taking selfies. This is how people used to sort of take selfies. So I think it's a tremendously interesting exhibition on the way portraiture work in East Tennessee. And just so you know a little bit about me, I should have mentioned this. You may not know, I'm from East Tennessee. I'm originally from Granger County. So I'm a native East Tennessean. I grew up there. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Tennessee. Then I was overseas for a while and got my doctorate. And I have returned home, which I'm very, very grateful for. And so that's my story. Other things I'd like to tell you about, since we are back in person again, I want to tell you about some upcoming events after today. So on July 21st, we'll be doing this again, also at noon. And our first speakers that will be coming in are Ren and Helen Davies, who have written a book about a man named George Alexander Brand, who was a remarkable photographer for the National Forest, and did a lot of really interesting work in the Smoky Mountain National Parks, and worked with Ansel Adams and that kind of stuff. So they'll be giving a talk on him. And then on August 10th, and this one will be in the evening, this one will be at 7 p.m. We're having a talk from Tyler Boyd, who's going to be coming in and talking about his award-winning book about Harry Burns, who of course played, Harry Byrne, who played a significant role in women's suffrage in East Tennessee. And that will be again on the 10th of August. So our speaker today is someone who I'm sure most of you know or have met, has done tremendously important work for Church Street Methodist, and is the historian for Church Street Methodist, in fact. He is a Sevier County native and a retired Knoxville physician. And he is a student of regional and local history. And since 1993, that's when he became the official historian of Church Street Methodist. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Dwight Wade to give his talk today about the Methodist Church.
Well, thank you, Dr. Doctor. I know that's not the first time you've been properly called by title as well as your last name. People get my medical guys in my class call me Dr. Doctor because my initials are DR. Now, I would like to say what you're going to hear today, should you be able to keep awake for an hour or less. First, about the challenges and the changes in the Methodist Church over the last 200 plus years. Some of the challenges have been really difficult, such as the Civil War. And I'll even be talking about a Civil War that you have not probably heard of. I want to thank some people who helped me with this book. I was in great need of editors, according to anybody who read the first excerpts of my book. One is Susan Seiler, who is with us today. Another is my cousin Mary Ann Thompson, who lives in Texas and may be watching, I hope. And she is a veteran of writing many books on family genealogy. And the last editor was Jan Wade, who you might guess is my wife, who was an English teacher and who really works me out on a regular basis about how to properly write the language. This book was written primarily to educate our church and particularly the youth about what our church has been through during the past couple of 100 years. We celebrated our bicentennial anniversary 5 years ago. And it was really challenging for us to present the story of this church to our members and to their children. And so this book is the result of the research that went into trying to do that. And a lot of it comes from our archives. Now, first, let's see if this is not working when I press the forward key to bring up the next slide. Now, well, we have a technician. At any rate, I will go ahead and try to make a start since we are limited to some time today. First of all, we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. Our church would not be here, and we would not be having this discussion except for a 6-year-old. Pulled from a fire in 1709. Any hands up for knowing who that was? Yes. The Methodists are in the group. His name was Wesley, of course. His first name was John, and his mother labeled him as a brand plucked from the fire. The clergy in those days were more interested in hunting and politics than they were in their parishioners. They rarely preached in church, but they hunted foxes a lot. In fact, one of their pastors was buried in his hunting piece. Tells you where the values were. So this church that you see would not be here today had it not been for John Wesley being saved. Here is a painting of the fire that happened, and the painting was done 130 years after the event. But it certainly does show the urgency of saving that child. Wesley joined his brother Charles's Holy Club. It was made up of young graduates who were very interested, as was Wesley, in living a righteous life, in studying and in preaching to those people who've been forgotten by the church. They formed societies, they made circuits, they converted people to their way of looking at the church and looking at the religion. And some of these people came to the United States, to the British colonies. Some of them were self-appointed preachers, and that group was growing. Wesley realized that, and he sent, let me go back here. He sent Francis Asbury over to organize and supervise the people who were here, to develop circuits, to grow the membership, and to welcome others who came from the old country, the mother country. This went on for about 20 years, until the Christmas conference in 1784. It was held because the Revolutionary War was now over. The Church of England priests who were in America had largely gone home after England lost the war. And Wesley believed it was time to actually establish an independent American Methodist Church, no longer dependent on the mother country. Edgar was ordained superintendent, and after the vote, he got on his horse. The next day, it was the first mile of 270,000 miles that he rode during his entire 45-year career. 270,000 miles. He wore out 6 or more horses, preached 16,000 plus sermons, and ordained 4,000 Methodist pastors. How do we know those data? It's because he kept a journal. And no journal was preserved. And you could go back and count where he was on a given day and what he did for all these 45 years. Imagine that. Is anybody here that methodical? You already ought to be a Methodist. His first ride went to Charleston, and it formed a pattern of what he was going to do for his next, for all the time he was here after that. In the wintertime, he would head south. He would visit the conferences and ordain pastors and visit the faithful Methodists he'd grown to know, and he would do the same thing in the north in the summer. So it was north-south, from Baltimore, which was sort of the center. Now, what happened during those times? There developed a system of Methodist organization, which I want to say something about. There is a general conference, somewhat like the Christmas conference, where the body of pastors come, but it was not that way after the Book of Discipline was done. It had both equal pastors and clergy doing the voting, setting the rules and traditions and policies of the Methodist Church. That group was called the General Conference, or that meeting, the General Conference, and it met every 4 years. And it's met every 4 years since 1800 or so. That is now full of global members. The Methodist Church has metastasized over the whole globe. And so when we have a general conference, people come from Africa, the Philippines, and all over. And that has influenced the vote. And we will get that to the end of this discussion because that has something to do with our current conference. This is the Book of Discipline, which was written a year after the Christmas conference. It established the first ever Methodist doctrine, policy, and standards. And there were 2 things that really governed the conflict of this country and of this church. It had to do with slavery, as you well know. It was the Methodist Church at that time followed Wesley's anti-slavery doctrine. And these 2 things were in the first Book of Discipline. All Methodist slaveholders were given 12 months to emancipate their slaves, or they would face expulsion from the church. Those people who merely sold their slaves would also be expelled likewise. It wasn't long before Southerners made such an outcry that Astor had to suspend these rules indefinitely. The same thing happened to the Constitutional Convention, which met 2 years later in 1787. The delegates to that convention that was trying to put together the states that formed this country could not agree on the slavery. And in essence, what they finally did was simply to table the issue about slavery in this country. And it would be tabled for several decades until you know what happened. And we'll get to that as well. The early circuit riders didn't fail to do their job. They were mostly young and single. They were hardy. They were very dedicated. They were willing to sleep under a tree or under a bush. They were willing to sleep anywhere that had a roof, whether it was a shed or a real house. They were on their circuit riding miles and miles to complete that circuit every so often. And it took some of them a long time. One of them that it took a long time to complete the circuit was Jeremiah Lambert. He was the very first circuit rider that arrived in what is now Tennessee. And it also covered the southwestern part of Virginia. That was the Holston Valley, and that's what our conference is. Our conference covers the eastern part of Tennessee and up into southwestern Virginia and all the way down to a little piece of Georgia, unless they've advocated. At any rate, think of this man looking 200 miles in the distance and imagining how he's going to ride his circuit. Well, he did. He found about 60 Methodists to organize. And when he left a year later for his next assignment, he had added 12. So that was quite a percentage of increase. Francis Asbury visited Knoxville for the very first time in 1800. In November 1800, Knoxville was the capital of the state, the capital city. And Asbury preached to several hundred people here from the State House, which was on State Street. At any rate, he was asked to spend the night by some fellow, all whose first name was Francis, but it was Francis Ramsey. Francis Ramsey was also one of the clear founders of Knoxville, and he lived in a very nice house. It was stone, and it was called Ramsey House, for those who may not have caught on already. And the thing that Francis Asbury said about it, it was a beautiful house. He rarely got a chance to spend the night in a house that nice on the frontier. And it was built by a man who didn't drink alcohol. That was his favorite memory of F.A. Ramsey. In 1816, John Haney was a Methodist, we would now call him who had a license to preach, who was also a merchant in Knoxville. He approached Hugh Lawson White at the request of Haney. He approached Hugh Lawson White with the request to donate a land for a Methodist church. White was just happy to do that, and he donated a half-acre land on something called Flint's Hill, later to be called Methodist Hill. It was located about 500 yards in this direction, where the Hyatt Regency Hotel is now saying what at least used to be the Hyatt Regency. And it had a small building, and it had a graveyard, and it was later called lovely White's Chapel. This is a conception of what that little church looked like, and you can see Blunt Mansion in the background there. It was not elegant, but it did have a graveyard, you can tell. And when that graveyard was excavated during an urban renewal project in the 60s, 350 remains were found. Half were either children or infants. Gives you an idea of the child mortality and infant mortality. This church was served by circuit riders for several years until 1827, when its first solo pastor was appointed. He was an outstanding person. He promoted the Sunday school concept in the church for the very first time. He performed heroic service during a typhoid epidemic that other Knoxvillians would not approach somebody who was sick with typhoid. He was a trustee of East Tennessee College. You better remember what happened at Tennessee College. the orange, right? He also promoted the idea of wholesome conference having its own college because young pastors, which were coming into the conference here, did not have as much education as the Presbyterian pastors, and they did need to have better education. The Second Great Awakening also happened at that time. This is not woke. This is awakening. And the camp meetings were held as long as a week of time, with families going with their wagons and spending the time. They heard many sermons, they had many prayers, they sang many hymns. They even had the shakes and the jerks and the swoons. The Methodists had the shakes, the Presbyterians, congregant Presbyterians, not these stately, starchy, regular Presbyterians. And the Baptists did the same. White's Chapel was too small because of this influx of new Methodists. And so Church Street got this First Methodist Church, and it was about 100 yards from where we're standing in the city. The congregation was 150 at the time. 40% or so were black. Between 1850 and 1862, the congregation grew to 345, with 3 Sunday school classes, 2 white and 1 black. By the time of the Civil War, this church still had plenty of black members, but they were to no longer be there by the time the Civil War got going. This is Emory and Henry College. If you'll notice the students with their legs are hanging out the windows, you know this is an honest picture of young students at any college. It was interesting that this college recruited some of its staff from the Northeast. Places like Massachusetts, like Boston, Cambridge. They came south and they embraced the Southern cultures. They embraced the idea of slavery. They were very happy with that. After all, they were up, Emory was in Virginia. For those of you that don't know, it was only about 40 or 50 miles from Bristol, Tennessee. But many of the people who came there were Virginians, and it was named for a couple of Virginians. It was named for Bishop John Emory, a Methodist bishop, which has had 2 or 3 schools named Emory for him. And the other was Governor Patrick Henry. What happened to Wesley's anti-slavery doctrine? It was diminished. The majority of the New Holston pastors were pro-slavery, and many later were anti-union. These circuit riders who were riding these circuits also had votes at the General Conference. Fewer and fewer Methodist pastors in the Holston Conference spoke of their anti-slavery beliefs because of the pressure of the need to appear to be pro-slavery if you were in a southern state. And we're talking mainly about Holston Conference here. In Middle and West Tennessee, it was a little different. The Methodist Church decided to split in 1844 because of the controversy of the slavery question. One of the Methodist bishops who had been Holston Conference bishop, James O. Andrew, owned 2 slaves. How he acquired these slaves is very interesting, and you can find that in this book. We don't have time to go through all of it, but basically he was headed toward the General Conference in New York, knowing that he may be the cause for the split. He really did not want to do that. He told his delegates from the South that he did not want to be the reason for the split, and he would be willing to resign. They asked him not to do that. They wanted a vote. They did get a vote, but the General Conference voted to eject him, and so the Southern conferences split from the northern conferences. That made you have the MEC Methodist Episcopal Church in the north, and the MEC South, the Methodist Episcopal Church in the south, two separate Methodist entities. This is the way it was in 1844, and it was that way for the next 94 years. Separation plans began, and they spent a month in New York City trying to iron it all out. Finally, it was thought to have an honorable separation. The next year, when separate delegates in the north and the south met, things were different. What had happened? First of all, in the MEC, slave-owning Methodists had to either get rid of their slaves by emancipating them, or they had to leave the church. Most of them decided to leave the church. What happened in the South? Anti-slavery pastors in our host of Congress began to keep quiet about the slavery issue. They no longer preached stormy sermons, at least most of them, about slavery. Tension rose between the older Olson Conference pastors who preached anti-slavery as it was taught by Wesley, against the younger circuit riding Henry and Henry Crane guys who were pro-slavery. Tension was such that actually a civil war developed between the two. One other thing that happened were the legal disputes about funds. The MEC, the new delegates there, decided, hey, the MEC South seceded from us. They don't deserve any funds that they were due before they split, even the ones who were retired. This became a serious problem for the MEC South. Another thing that happened to this area during that time in the 1850s was the railroad was built between Virginia and all the way down to Chattanooga that actually connected Virginia with Alabama and Georgia. This was important to commerce. Knoxville benefited from it. We had new railroaders coming in building it. We had noticed that most of them were Irish Catholics, and as a result, there was the Immaculate Conception. In this general direction that was established, and it was built by the hands of those workers. They also had built some new saloons, so I'm told. The recruitment of the troops for this battle between the North and South happened in Knoxville on Gay Street, just outside that door, in January of 1861. You had one group on one end of the street recruiting Union recruits, and you had the Confederate recruits on the other. And this picture is in the McClung collection here, and we are using it in the book by permission by some of the people here arranged it. Fort Sumter was attacked in April. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers from each state to suppress the rebellion. That call for 75,000 troops from Tennessee caused the Tennesseans to vote to leave the Union. About 1/3 of the votes were for remaining with the Union, and 2/3 were for leaving. The 2/3 of the votes for leaving were more in the Middle and West Tennessee, which had the slave-driven economy, and in East Tennessee, where there were very few, relatively, they voted to stay. But the ones who wanted to stay lost, and so Tennessee left the Union. Abe Lincoln approved a secret plan to burn the railroad bridges along that red line that I just showed you. The railroad crossed several rivers between here and Bristol. At that time, it was also a military objective for both armies. The plan to burn the bridges was about half successful, and what it did was create lots of anxiety, and East Tennessee was put under martial law by General Felix Zollicoffer, who used to work in Knoxville 20 years before that on the newspaper. When that happened, churches in this area that were friendly to the north were confiscated by the Confederate troops. And Church Street, which belonged to the MEC South, was left alone for a while because they were part of the good guys. This changed in about 2 years, and we'll get to that in a moment. Meanwhile, a civil war developed between pastors and their flocks within the Holston Conference. And what they did to each other was outlined very well by Durwood Dunn. Dr. Dunn wrote this book, and it was published in 2014. It's called Civil War in Southern Appalachian Methodism. Reading this really opens your eyes to what can happen with man's inhumanity to man when the chips are really down as they were. I could hardly believe what Methodists did to Methodists during that time, especially the bishops and the leaders of the Methodist Church, who were on two different sides. Reverend Doody, who was a Sevier County circuit rider, was old and obese and very anti-slavery. Unfortunately for him, he was captured. He was made to walk miles and miles to Knoxville with no water, no food, and he was a very sick man when he arrived and got put in jail. It took him years to recover from this. Reverend William H. Rogers, who was a friend of Parson Brownlow. W.G. Brownlow was a pastor in the Methodist Church and was a circuit rider for many years before he became a very well-known editor. And that's what most of us remember him for, as to how polemic and how descriptive he could be, how wonderfully descriptive he could be when he was attacking someone. At any rate, William Rogers, his friend, because he was friends with Brownlow, who was a firm unionist, was put in jail. They put Brownlow in jail too, suspecting him of being related to the bridge burnings. He was later released and allowed to cross the Union lines in Nashville. Reverend Levi Carter, a Methodist pastor, was murdered. His son was then tortured and killed. These are just three tiny kinds of instances of what happened in that time. And it's hard to believe. And I think the store here is going to look to see if they can get some of these books by Durwood Dunn for sale. It's still in print, even though Dunn died about 2 weeks after the book was published in 2014. The Union Army occupation for the last 2 years of the war happened when Burnside showed up with a lot of troops north of here and the Southern defenders left. Suddenly, Union troops were all over the city and the surrounding area for miles. Suddenly, the United Methodist Church South, now United, but the Methodist Church Street United. I'm sorry, I keep saying United because it's just been there for too long. But the Church Street Church on Church Street, not far from here, confiscated by the Union troops to use as a hospital and later as a place to keep the horses and cavalry. The Battle of Fort Sanders happened after Longstreet came up from the Chattanooga area and put the town under siege for several weeks. The prolonged siege really brought a food shortage to Knoxville, to the civilians here. Burnside was down to 3 days of quarter rations of his troops when Longstreet decided to attack. He thought it would be a quick attack, a short victory, and certainly it was a short fight, but it was not a victory for him. He lost more than 800 casualties to 50 for the Union defenders. Now, this was just one battle. They had been fighting for weeks, and there were casualties related to that. So this is not the whole casualties from all of that fighting, but it is the casualties from that single battle. Longstreet saw his losses and was thinking about attacking again when he found out General Sherman was on his way with 25,000 troops from the Chattanooga area, and so he decided to leave town. He moved his troops towards Morristown. Our church lost somebody special at that time. It was Isaac Lewis, the first solo pastor that had come to the church in 1827. He was a Virginian by birth. He was pro-slavery, and he had 2 sons fighting in the Confederate Army. The Union found out, and they arrested him and put him under house arrest because they suspected he might be a spy. He was maltreated for weeks and weeks, and finally died. His daughter described the scene of his death in his last words, which are well worth reading, but which time does not allow for right now. So I hope you will read that. The reason the letter survived was that it was sent to the Richmond Times and thereby preserved. What happened after 2 years more of Union occupation here after their victory? The war ended, and there was post-war rebuilding. What did the victorious MEC do? They confiscated the church. And the church was about 50 yards or so from here, and the property, and they fixed it up because it needed some repair. And they lived in that church and worshiped in it while they built their other church that faced Clinch about a block in this church. Church Street's new pastor, Charles Carroll, got here. There was no church. There was no road. And he was rescued by Elizabeth Truslow, who was 68 and who'd been a member of this church because she had moved here with her daughter and she married a prominent Knoxvillian who was also a member of Church Street. Truslow could remember 50 people. And so they started with those 50 people in the basement of the First Presbyterian Church, which was hospitable, and they grew their roll to 178 after the first year. In 1871, this is the view of Knoxville. And if I can get my pointer working, I will try to show you just 2 things. This is where the original church was on Methodist Hill. And sorry, I'm not being able to see this quite as well. But Church Street is in this area, and here it is. This is what the church looked like. It's still in the hands of the Morgan church or the BC at that time. And there's a little floppy building right here. The Methodists built that building, and they worshiped in that while they were suing the Methodists to get their property back. It took several years. Meanwhile, the Methodists were living right across the street, or were worshiping right across the street from their own what they consider their own property. At any rate, it did get solved by 1876, and they built a new church. This is what it looked like. This is what it looked like in 1921. Because there were no automobiles in 1878 in Knoxville when they first moved in. My guess. But it was a beautiful Victorian Gothic church. And it was built for a cost of $20,000. Since they had 347 members, that meant that it was built at a cost of $57.50 per member. Think about building a church today for $57.50. You have to have quite a few members. It did grow and on that side, and it needed a new building. And they were having a hard time deciding where and how big and exactly whether they should be on their own property or buy new property. Meanwhile, here is the only picture that exists of the inside of that church. You can see the organ, you can see the pews, and you can see the decorations for Children's Day, which was a big deal for this church once a year. The fire solved the problem of inaction about building a new church. In February of 1928, they were in the church meeting Sunday worship in the evening when a fire broke out in the ceiling. Fortunately, it was seen quickly, and it was at the end of the sermon. So everybody got out quickly, and one person was really upset as they watched the fire. It was the organist who said she was so worried because she had forgotten to lock the organ case. That sentiment has stayed in this church ever since 1928. The church finally did decide to build. So they raised the money for pledges. And then suddenly in 1929, something bad happened to the stock market. I'm sure all of you know what that was. And they stopped the pause and they prayed and finally decided to go ahead and build on faith. They built at Henley and West Main, which is where we are now. Unfortunately, 2 months after they started the construction, under the leadership of contractor H.A. Irvin, who was a Church Street member, he was shot and killed in the front yard of the church while his workers looked on. This was a terrible tragedy for the church, and one more thing it had to overcome. But there just happened to be another contractor in the congregation named Worsham. So the Worsham brothers picked up 1 week later and built the church. Here's what it looked like towards the end of the year, and here's what it looked like during their very first worship center, or their worship service, January 25th, 1931, when 1,000 people came. They all had to sit in cane-bottom chairs because there were no pews. We still have some of those cane-bottom chairs. In fact, I sat in one of them. It was really squeaky. It was Sunday morning in our Sunday school class. It wasn't very well decorated. There were burlap sheets hanging on the walls of the chancel. There was no pulpit. There was no organ. There's no altar. It was sort of empty. It's sort of like when our new pastors came this past year. They couldn't meet the church. They couldn't meet the people because we were shut down. Anybody in here remember that? It was still celebrated, and they made do with. By the end of that year, 1931, they did have a beautiful gift. It was an altar, a memorial to Eleanor Audiger, and it was given by her husband, Louis. Eleanor had grown up in the church, and even though they were living in Rome when she died, due to his work, the body came home, and he wanted to have a memo in the church, a memorial to her. It was gratefully accepted by Dr. Harcourt Morgan. Anybody know Morgan? He was chair of the board of trustees, right? Also president of the University of Tennessee. 2 years after the church began worshiping, it became the very depth of the recession, of the depression, not recession. Unemployment was very high. Money was scarce. Average working man in Knoxville made $20 a week. George Smith, a member, was hired as the church business manager. It really needed a penny pension. The children saved pennies for the Sunday offering. Members contacted those who were behind on their pledges. Some families sold some of their furniture in order to support the church, and 12 church families put up their homes as security for about half of the total church loan, which was somewhere around $250,000+ at that time. That was half of the loan. At one point, the church could not pay its pastor for 3 months. It would be 20 more years before the debt was paid. There were 2 celebrations in 1939. One, the church paid off the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had the loan because the bank here in Knoxville had failed, that had set the loan in the first place. The second thing that happened, this made the debt manageable, by the way. The MEC and the MEC South reunited after those 94 years. And it was joined by the Methodist Protestant Church, which was a smaller section of Methodist, and which had withdrawn and split from the Methodist Church not too long after it was first formed, way back in the early 1800s, because they wanted to be a congressional church. They did not want to be an Episcopal church. They changed their minds in 1939 and came back aboard. 2 other churches that split, or 2 other entities, were the AME and the AME Zion, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Both of those split in the early 1800s. One was in Philadelphia, the other was in New York, and they split simply because the Methodists would not treat them in a humane way in the church. They did what was natural. They withdrew and started their own church. These are only a few of the splits of the Methodist Church. There were some tiny splits here and there, but the ones that you just heard of so far are the major ones and the major challenges and changes in this Methodist Church over this 200 years. There was another church on pacifism, and this was a popular thing in America after World War I. But the Methodist Church voted not to be pacifist. They said they will recognize and protect the rights of conscientious objectors, but the conscientious objector idea cannot dictate what the Methodist Church does. This controversy has not come up since then. The United Methodist Church was formed in 1968, and the agreement of the 1968 merger of the Evangelical United Church of the Brethren actually helped because the agreement was dissolved with the Methodist Central Jurisdiction. What was the Methodist Central Jurisdiction? That's where all the black churches were placed. When about 40 or 50 years later, earlier, the church became the Methodist Church when the North and South reunited. This agreement allowed us to have the Olson Conference to have its first African American bishop. We had a second African American bishop a few years later, and both these bishops performed very, very well and were very well received, thank goodness. In the last 50 years, there were 2 more things added: a church life center and a new addition about 3 years ago, which allowed us to have good, easy access for the first time. This is what we look like now. And this is the last general controversy, and I have a couple of minutes, I think, to describe it, and I will try and boil it down to this. The issue of human sexuality has been perking for a few years, but it boiled down in 2019 at a special general conference in that whether or not Methodist clergy who were gay could be ordained, and the other was whether or not the Methodist Church would allow or would host same-sex marriages. There were some churches in America that really wanted to do both these things. And there were churches globally who were dead set against it. Remember, we are now a global church, and those very, very conservative churches in Africa and other areas of the world were dead set against this. It was we were due to have some further negotiations perhaps on this in 2020, but the pandemic kept the General Conference of 2020 from happening, and it's still not scheduled. So we are still in a bit uncertainty about how this is going to work out. We are not uncertain about some things. Our congregation has acted like a bunch of passengers in a boat. This symbol is on our chapel wall. This boat has a very excellent captain. We see that captain each time we come to church. It is a full-length welcoming Christ that stands with outstretched hands above the altar that was given in honor of Eleanor Audiger in 1931. Our congregation knows one thing: regardless of what is going on, we trust our captain, whether the sea is calm or whether the sea is stormy. So I will give that as the last testimony, and things are open for questions if there are some. And I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.
I just want to take this opportunity to open the floor for questions, if anyone has any, and then I'll sit back down and get out of the way.
We do have a question on one of our Zoom guests, and we have about 40 people that are joining us virtually. So, and I'll ask you to repeat the question or answer the question in your answer, or share it in your answer. Can you locate the specific block along Church Street where the original church was built? Maybe with landmarks or references for folks today.
Yes. The question is, could we locate exactly where the church was? The old fire maps for Knoxville allowed us to do that precisely. It was at 406 Church Street. It was about a building and a half from Gay Street, and it was identified by a plaque for many years. But when the new building was built and the parking lot that I tried to park in this morning was built, that was lost when that building was torn down. But we know exactly where it was, and it was here. And I can get more specific if you need it, whoever you are in Zoom land. But it is very easily located. Any other questions, Zoom or present here?
I have a question. Was it 1839 that the church decided to not be anti-slavery, and became Methodist Episcopal South? I guess it was in
1844.
1840 something.
Is
Okay.
when that clear-cut division happened in the church. Prior to that time, the northern churches were campaigning for emancipation strongly. Incidentally, the first newspaper that was called the Emancipator, the very first newspaper that promoted emancipation was in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And there were other emancipation efforts in Tennessee, but they were especially true in the north, and the South didn't like it.
But there were some Knoxville area, at least Knoxville area there's a book called Divided Loyalties that talks about that. There were people on both sides.
Yes,
Living and working together
absolutely.
and trying to keep going. What happened to the people in Church Street who were anti-slavery after the church decided to become Methodist Episcopal of the South? Did they go off and start another church?
There were some lawsuits, yes. They were not identified specifically in anything that I read, except that there were some lawsuits. And some of the people moved to Memphis or other cities in the same state where they were comfortable in the Methodist church, that they transferred their work. And as you know, during the conflict, some brothers were fighting brothers in families, some of which were fighting for the South and some for the North. Uncles, others in my county, Sevier County. One of the reasons I got into history was to find out about my great grandfather. I found that all of them fought for the North. They had to sneak out of Tennessee to join their regiment. Some of them got captured. 3 were on the Sultana when it blew up. 1 did not survive, 2 did. And if one of them hadn't survived that did, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. But this was just true all over the border states, especially. Yes.
Susie will remember this. Bishop Allen hosted the United Methodist Colson Conference at Church Street one year.
Bill Scott Allen, the first African American pastor. Now I've used the word African American in fact because it is used commonly, and there's no offense meant either way for the use of those terms. Yes, Mary Ellen.
What happened with the Presbyterians? Did they have such a conflict?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. The First Presbyterian favored the South, and that was true of the only churches that didn't have some kind of a conflict was the Catholic Church, and of course, its chief driver was living in Rome, not this country. Even those who deny it otherwise did have some splits within their church during that civil war, whether it was the Episcopal Church or others. Yes.
Didn't those people from East Tennessee that joined the Union Army, weren't they assembled up in Eastern Kentucky?
Yes. That's why I said they had to sneak across the Kentucky line in order to find their unit. Thank you very much. I do appreciate these insightful questions and appreciate the chance to be here at the Historical Society meeting. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. Dwight Wade, for your fascinating talk. I would like to encourage everyone who's not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society to join. We have some brochures at the back. And I hope that you've had a very enjoyable and informative lunch. And thank you very much. And we look forward to you coming next time.
We do have somebody who'd like to stand up and talk about
Books.
Can I just share a quick
Yes,
thing
please.
about books?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Stranges. I work at the church, and I can't let you go without sharing this beautiful volume with you that Dwight has put together. He spent so much time researching, and the stories, you've only heard a fraction of them today. And we have a special price today for you for $60, and the books are over here, and Dr. Wade will be here to personalize them as you wish. But I keep mine on my coffee table as a lifelong United Methodist, and the native Tennessean people that visit my house love to look through the book, read more about the stories, and see the beautiful photography here by Jim Wells. So I encourage you to go and at least peruse it and get a copy for yourself. Thank you.